Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar today around addressing and tackling sexual harassment in the workplace. Before we start, I can see a lot of you have already found the chat on the right hand side, but please do ask any questions that you might want answering in the chat, and we'll either try and answer them as we go through or at the end of the webinar. And if we don't get time to answer them all, we will come back to you after the webinar and follow up with you. There's been an overwhelming response to this webinar today, so it's great to see so many of you here. It's obviously a topic which is particularly interesting at the moment, and we're hearing more and more of our customers talking in general about not only the prevention of sexual harassment, but also how to tackle it when it does happen. So we'll be covering that today. We've also launched some training courses on this topic as well because of the interest from our customer base. So if that's something that is of interest to you, please do either let us know in the chat or follow up with us after the session. So before we get started, I just want to introduce who we have with us today. So it's a slight change to the advertised running order, but we do have two additional experts you'll be pleased to hear. So we have Eve Maxwell, who's our head of training. We have Tim Smith, who's SafeCall's operations director, and importantly heads up our investigations business unit here at SafeCall. And we also really be delighted to be joined by Christine Young, who's a partner in employment law at Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer, and we'll be able to talk a bit about the legal aspects as well. So before we get started, I mentioned that there'd been a very strong response to this particular topic when we sent out the webinar. So I'm really interested in understanding, by doing a quick poll, has your organisation had to deal with any allegations about sexual harassment in the last 12 months? It's all anonymous, so don't worry about that, but just really interesting to gauge sort of where everybody's at. So they're still coming in, but I think just sort of meant to the panel here, I think that's an interesting set of statistics there, because it's great to see that 51% of organisations haven't had to deal with that. But I suppose some of the things we'll talk about today is the importance of knowing what's happening, and just because you haven't heard about it doesn't necessarily, hopefully it means it isn't happening, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the case. And obviously quite a high percentage of organisations have had allegations of sexual harassment, so you know, quite a large percentage. Just over to the panel there for any sort of observations or any thoughts on that before we move into the main section. Eve, I'll come to you first. Everyone's very polite.
An interesting one, isn't it? I think it sort of speaks to, you know, does this mean if we're not hearing about it, does this mean it's not going on? Or does it mean that people just don't feel comfortable coming forward and sort of reporting it? So I think I mean, we're going to talk about this in the webinar, but it's about how do you create that environment where, you know, people do feel safe to speak up, and people do have trust that their organisation will do something about it and address it.
Indeed. Christine, any thoughts from you at this stage?
And I think it's interesting where organisations haven't seen sexual harassment. That's obviously a great thing if it's not going ahead. I think one of the things we've noticed is a trend for more people to raise allegations of sexual harassment since the preventative duty came in October, and people undertook more training with staff and raised awareness of what sexual harassment actually is, as well as encouraging people to report it. So I think generally there's more of an upwards trend, although obviously it depends organisation to organisation what's going on.
Absolutely. We'll just move on to the definition of sexual harassment. And this, you know, Eve, I know this is something that you talk about in your training, so I'm going to come to you first here, but what is it that we mean by sexual harassment?
Well, sexual harassment, you can see the definition there according to the Equality Act. And I think there are a couple of things to take out that definition. It's really about the impact that sexual harassment has on the individual. So it's where a person subject to unwanted conduct of a sexual nature, but it's not about whether that person intended to cause offence or to upset people or to harass people. It's about whether or not their actions have created an environment that is intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive. So sexual harassment can cover a range of different types of behaviours. So it can be verbal, so what people say to each other. It can be around body language or the gestures that people make in the workplace. It can be physical, so that's what we often think about, sort of unwanted touching. But it can also be, you don't even have to be in the same room as someone to be sexually harassed. It can be something that happens online, via email, via text. And we did actually see an uptick in sexual harassment sort of during that COVID period where people were working from home. So, you know, there was more of that sort of online harassment going on. So sexual harassment can be a range of different things, but it's about the impact on the individual and how it makes them feel in the workplace.
Thanks, Eve. Christine, is there anything that you would add here?
And I absolutely agree with Eve that most of the time the issue is not where someone is purposely sexually harassing, it's the effect it is on the individual who's the recipient. And the intent is not relevant. Just because the individual said, "I didn't mean to do it," doesn't mean it's not sexual harassment. I think there's an interesting example. The EHRC gave some guidance around this point, and they gave an example in their guidance where male workers were downloading certain inappropriate images onto their computers, and there was a woman present. The woman then made a claim for sexual harassment because she was aware of the images that were being downloaded, and that created the hostile and humiliating environment for her. It was irrelevant that the male colleagues didn't intend to upset her. That wasn't what they were trying to do. They just saw it as having a laugh, but that still created the sexual harassment. So I think that's kind of a helpful example of how this could be looked at.
Yeah, it's a lot more wide reaching than perhaps some people would imagine. So today we're here obviously to talk about it with regards to the workplace specifically. So Eve, just coming back to you for a moment there, how common is it in the workplace?
It's pretty common. Sadly, it's also pretty common in society. So it's unsurprising, that we're seeing sexual harassment in the workplace. And, most of the time it is women that are affected, and you can see some of the statistics there. So over 40% of women experience sexual harassment at some point in their working lives, which is a huge number of people affected by this. And, if you think about, the workplace, it's the second most common location for sexual harassment too. So this is something we need to be mindful of. The other thing just to mention as well, it's not just women. Men are also affected by sexual harassment in the workplace. So this is something where you've got to think, as an employer, think broadly about who might be experiencing harassment if it's happening. And we've also got to think about certain groups as well. So, we don't want to lump people into males or females. It's much more nuanced than that. And there are actually certain groups within the workplace that are disproportionately affected by sexual harassment. So people with disabilities, ethnic minorities, or LGBT workers are more likely to experience sexual harassment in the workplace, and also young women. So there are certain groups, if you're thinking about this from an employer's perspective, certain groups that might be more at risk of sexual harassment in the workplace.
This probably sounds like a really obvious thing to say, but it can have a significant impact on individuals, can't it, Eve?
Oh, it's huge. It's absolutely huge. So if you think about somebody who's experienced sexual harassment, it's going to affect them how they feel sort of physically, mentally. Unsurprisingly, you know, things like job satisfaction and performance are going to take a dip, because, you know, if someone is experiencing that horrible, degrading, offensive environment, they're not going to be performing at their best, and it is going to have an impact on how they feel. But I think it's not just the individual that's involved that, you know, this can have a negative impact on. If colleagues and team members see that the organisation hasn't dealt with it effectively and it's something that's been allowed to continue, then it also has a negative impact on the wider business as well. So teams see what's going on, colleagues see what's going on, and it also affects things like their motivation, performance too.
Thanks, Eve. And Christine, we're going to talk about this in a little more detail in a while, but rewards paid at employment tribunals for sexual harassment can be quite significant, can't they?
Yeah, that's right. And you can have uncapped amounts depending on the loss suffered, and there's also injury to feelings awards. In relation to the harassment. So yes, it can be quite significant. And you know, we've seen quite a number of cases come through the employment tribunal. I think that back in 2024, we had 125 decisions just on sexual harassment alone. And that's not including all the cases that have actually been raised. They're the ones that get to the final decision. So a large number of cases, and potentially significant amounts depending on the severity of the harassment. Obviously, it depends on exactly what's happened.
Of course. And you mentioned at the beginning that there's been recent legislation with the Worker Protection Act that's kind of raised, I suppose, not the profile, but certainly added additional protection to for workers with a view to kind of taking reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment as opposed to responding to it when it happens. So, Christine, I'm going to come back to you here because, you know, what have the legal changes and the impact of those changes been?
So back in October 2024, the new legislation took effect. So it means that employers have a duty to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment of the employees in the course of their employment. I should say that's the law as came into force in October 2024. The government's already looking to amend that and to put a higher threshold to all reasonable steps rather than just reasonable steps. So for now, it's reasonable steps, but it looks like that it will change to all reasonable steps. What does that mean? It means a higher threshold. You know, you need to take more action to try and prevent sexual harassment happening. It applies to workers, not just employees. And the duty is to try and prevent third parties sexually harassing employees, not just within the organization. And that can be very relevant. For example, if they are engaging with suppliers or at industry events and so on. Although technically the employer isn't directly liable for the third party harassment, although again, that is something that is proposed to change with the government's proposed amendments. As Eve mentioned earlier, that covers all kinds of sexual harassment. So it could be verbal, physical, visual, and it doesn't actually need to be directed at the complainant, at the individual. They can just suffer the sexual harassment as a result. What that means, well, the EHRC gave very detailed guidance on steps that employers can take. Some of the obvious examples are having up-to-date policies that specifically deal with sexual harassment, and prohibit it and explain what you should do if you in fact suffer sexual harassment, how to report it, how it's dealt with. Appropriate training, which I know Eve will cover in detail, and relevant to individuals and how they raise complaints, what behaviour is expected of staff, as well as how to deal with complaints that are raised, and undertaking risk assessments to work out, well, where are the areas in your business where there's a particular risk that sexual harassment might happen. And obviously it's different depending on the organisation. So really trying to grapple with where's the risk areas, how do we address that? There's also an obligation to investigate where sexual harassment has occurred. So in other words, you've got to do something about it to get to the bottom of it and address it. Obviously, it depends on the size and the resources of the employer as to what is actually considered to be reasonable. But the technical guidance gives quite a lot of steps and things that you can think about as an organisation. In addition to the things that we've already talked about, some of the things include surveys with staff to try and understand from them about what issues might be relevant in the organisation, and consulting with employee representatives. So the legal obligation then is to take these reasonable steps. What happens if you don't? Well, if the employer fails to do so, then obviously, as Eve mentioned, it will have a profound effect on the individual. Not just the original sexual harassment, but how the incident is dealt with by the employer is highly relevant to how someone feels about the whole situation, and impacts on colleagues, in terms of the work environment, if they're seeing sexual harassment being appropriately dealt with, and trying to minimize it happening. But also in terms of claims. So an individual can bring a claim in relation to this duty, but it can't be brought on its own. You have to have an original claim. So say, for example, you had suffered sexual harassment and you brought a claim, you could also bring a claim in relation to any failure by the employer to take those reasonable steps. And if a tribunal concluded that is what had in fact happened, then there could be an uplift on the award of up to 25%. Also, separately to that, the EHRC can investigate and can take enforcement action. So setting out notices, or having binding agreements with companies, or it has the power to injunct as well. So there's these other potential consequences if the employer does not take these reasonable steps that they're required to do.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Christine. And a couple of things that you said there really resonated with the kind of wider whistleblowing sort of landscape that we see generally, because, obviously there is a kind of reputational and financial risk about getting this wrong. But, almost as importantly or more importantly, it's that sort of trust that the employee has within the organization they work for. And it's really, building that culture of trust. And if people feel able to speak up, it takes a lot of courage, and especially around something so deeply personal, that response is so important in terms of like how you respond to that, and how you deal with that is I guess paramount, getting that right, and having a process, like you were saying, in place to make sure that you know what to do, which I know Eve and everyone will come on to in a bit more detail, but that really resonated with me as within what you were saying there. So just before we go to another poll, there are a couple of questions that have come through that I thought would be worth addressing now. Kerry hasn't asked a question so much, but Christine, you may have a view on it, because she says, we have a zero tolerance approach and find it more challenging dealing with individuals who have mentioned something then don't want to take it further.
Yeah, that's really tricky, because if you have knowledge of it, you want to deal with the situation, but clearly if the individual says I don't want to deal with it, it sort of ties your hands. And also, obviously, to properly investigate, you need the help of the person who's raising the complaint, because usually they have all the details to allow you to investigate. So that is challenging. I think we usually try and encourage the individual to allow us to look into the matter and investigate, because otherwise we're not going to be able to do a lot about it if we can't look into the issue and really get to the bottom of what's happened and try and stop it from happening again.
There's a couple of other questions that I'll come on to later, because they are probably more relevant in the investigation section. There is, Sarah has mentioned though, and I think Christine, it's a good point. She said it might be worth clarifying that the legal duties and consequences that we're talking about, are they according to UK and or EU law, as it seems we're from all over the world, so different legalities? Very
good point. So I'm talking about UK legislation, which is where the law that came in October 2024 applies to, and also the changes that I mentioned they're coming down the track are in relation to UK law. So they're the preventative duty I'm talking about is a UK domestic piece of legislation.
Absolutely, thank you. So we're going to do another poll now before we move on. So we talked before about the fact there's been a lot of interest in this webinar, and the fact that, you know, often that happens as a result of legislation. So we're just interested to understand whether you've seen those changes that Christine talked about as a result of recent changes in legislation. Now, as we've got a global audience, you know, that there may be some nuances, but that's interesting because at the moment it's looking as though for the majority of people it hasn't changed significantly, although there is still a reasonably high percentage there, about 13 or 14%, who are seeing more complaints. So Christine, yeah, obviously again with our UK lens, does that echo what you're seeing, or would you have expected to see different stats?
I think it's interesting because obviously we do have an international audience, and in other jurisdictions like Australia, they've had a very similar piece of legislation in place for a little bit longer than we have. So with that lens, then obviously the October deadline hasn't really had an impact. I think we've seen a slight uptick. We have seen, you know, more sexual harassment allegations coming forward. But again, I think it depends on the makeup of your organization and you know, how it's, if you already had a number of reports, then you may not see such a great uptick.
Absolutely. I think regardless of legislation, something that I'm really passionate about is that whole cultural piece. And ultimately, I'm sure we all want to work in organisations where preventing sexual harassment is taken seriously, and people have the appropriate level of kind of support and training to deal with things that are raised. So I'm just going to move on now on that note to talk a little bit about, you know, what employers can do, because as we've said, the onus is on employers to make sure that their workplaces are safe for the individuals that work there and that they're doing what they can to prevent sexual harassment happening. So the approach really needs to be proactive rather than reactive. So Eve, I'm really interested in some of the things that organisations might want to think about with regards to that.
Yeah, I think as Christy mentioned earlier, you know, it depends what you do depends on your organisation, the size of your organisation, resources, and I think this is also true for thinking about preventative measures. You know, what risks might your employees face in their day-to-day work? So this is going to be very individual. There's not a one size fits all where you can sort of do a little checkbox and say, oh, this applies or this doesn't apply. It's about really looking at your employees' experience from their perspective. So it's thinking about what you're going to do to mitigate those risks, what the level of risk is, and putting some things in place before you end up with a report of sexual harassment. So it's trying to just stop it from happening in the first place by thinking about the working environment from the employee's perspective. Christine also made a really good point about having policies in place, but we know that not everybody reads policies. Not everybody goes onto your intranet and looks at all your policies and says, right, we're gonna get to the bottom of what's happening in your dignity at work policy or your sexual harassment policy. So this is about really communicating what your organisation is going to do to protect you. And this includes training. As head of training, naturally, I'm very biased. I think we should have training on these things to raise awareness. And during that training, really making it crystal clear how employees can report sexual harassment in the workplace too. So it's linking your policies, linking your reporting channels to the awareness raising that you're doing within your organisation. Line managers, I'm a huge champion of line managers because they really are the glue that holds everything together in an organisation, and they are crucial if you want to create the right team cultures, if you want to make people feel psychologically safe in the workplace. Your line manager is your key individual there who's going to help you achieve that. So the line manager really sets the tone for what is acceptable within their team. So they are absolutely crucial. The other thing, you can't just rest on your laurels and say, oh, we've done our assessment, we've got our policy, we've done our training. It's about going back and reviewing it. Things change, the workplace changes, the environment changes, your employees change. It's about going back and checking that the things that you've put in place, the preventative measures that you've set up, are actually doing their job. And it's things like, are people following the processes? So you've set a process out. Are people actually following it? How do you know? How are you going to have any oversight over that? So it's looking at, the steps that you've set out. Are they successful? Are they effective? And going back and reviewing that regularly to make sure that, you can be confident that your processes are robust.
Completely agree with that, Eve. And I think one of the other things which we do have a question on as well is around that sort of reporting channel choice. Because like you say, even though a lot of people will go to their organisation or to their line manager, I think high proportion it is direct to their line manager, there will be instances where people don't feel comfortable for whatever reason having that conversation, and having that choice of where to report really does help. And I think that's why a lot of people do choose to use our independent whistleblowing channel for those types of reports, because they can speak up anonymously. And our recent benchmarking report shows that this is not just for sexual harassment, this is generally that around 60% of reports that we get are now anonymous. So it shows that people want to be able to speak up, but equally they want to protect their identity and they need a channel to be able to do that. The question that we have had that we'll try and answer now, and Tim, I think it's a good one for you to answer actually, is how will SafeCall support victims that make a complaint to SafeCall but do want to remain anonymous?
I think the first thing from SafeCall's perspective, and as a confidence builder for people ringing, is that all of our call handlers are former police officers who have a wealth of experience and skills and a lifetime of responding to and talking to victims of this type of incident. But here at SafeCall, anonymity is absolutely everything for us. We would need a judge probably to arrive at our doorstep in person with the writ before we would reveal anybody's anonymity details. We have a hybrid which is called semi-anonymous, and that can be really quite important in issues such as this. And that caters for the case where someone who's been a victim, for example, of sexual harassment, is okay to share their details with SafeCall, but isn't quite yet confident enough to share those details with their own organisation until they get some confidence, and that may be via the messaging system. And it can be as simple as somebody a respondent knowing that the person that's going to be investigating their issue, that they have confidence in that person. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on, but it is a great way of people building the confidence to be then able to come forward as a named individual, which is obviously significantly better from an evidential point of view. If you're looking to, if something is going to progress through discipline systems, performance systems or whatever, it's far better to have that named person. And of course, you can then provide that named person with the support that we'd all like people to have in these situations.
Thanks, Tim. And Karen asked, Karen said, our SLT are very against anonymous reporting, as we've been able to do anything about it. How would you suggest we manage reporting given this? Great question, Karen, and something that we get asked generally quite regularly. We, as Tim just mentioned there, one of the channels that we have available within our reporting system is anonymous two-way messaging. So you can still communicate with that reporter, even if you don't know who they are, to potentially get additional information if they're happy to provide that. The other thing is, as Tim will come on to, often what we find is if somebody has called us and is speaking to one of our experienced call handlers, they may initially want to remain anonymous, but once they understand how that report's going to be handled, we quite often find that they're happy to give more information, which obviously then helps you with your ongoing investigation. But Tim will come on to that a little bit more in the not too distant future. But just before we go on to that, Eve, you mentioned before that line managers are such a key part in this process. So let's talk a little bit more about that.
Yes, so the good news is that employees are more likely to go to their line manager than anybody else if they've got a concern about misconduct or malpractice. So line managers are in a trusted position. They are a great source of support for employees. But our managers are, not receiving appropriate training, not receiving the training regularly. And that puts a lot of pressure on the line manager too, because, do they feel confident to respond effectively if someone came to them with a report about sexual harassment? This is a really, really sensitive conversation to have. People who have experienced sexual harassment often feel very like they've lost some control. They might feel embarrassed. They might feel very upset. And the sort of conversations that the line manager needs to have with that individual are really to be very sensitive to that and very professional. And if you're not dealing with that all the time, if this is something that happens once in a blue moon, or it's your first time, the line manager might not respond in the best sort of way. So, when we're thinking about preventative measures, training managers so that they are ready to respond effectively is a key part of that, really. And certainly when we're doing training on this, we look at, what to do, what you definitely shouldn't do when someone comes to you with a sexual harassment report, because you need to get that first response right. If you don't get that first response right, it really can have a knock-on effect, not just for that individual, but for their colleagues and their team members too. So this is about giving line managers who are trusted within the workplace the skills and knowledge to handle those reports effectively.
Thank you, Eve. And that's something that you cover in your training, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's just about really, giving people the skills and the knowledge to be able to as a starting point for those sensitive conversations. Thanks,
Eve. We're going to move on now to talk a bit about investigations and the best way of approaching investigations. So we've talked about what sexual harassment is, the legislation that surrounds that, and some of the mechanisms that we can put in place to help prevent and also to train people appropriately if allegations of sexual harassment are raised. But if we need, if that happens, then we need to make sure that we've got the right tools in place to investigate those appropriately. So, Christine, you mentioned earlier that organisations need to promptly investigate any allegations of sexual harassment. So what are the legal consequences of not doing that?
So as I flagged earlier, you could end up in a situation where other than affecting the individual and how they feel about how the organisation has dealt with the situation and how their colleagues see how the organisation has failed perhaps to deal with it properly, you could end up in employment litigation, and the individual not only bringing their claim for sexual harassment, but also the failure, the claim in respect of that failure to take those steps. And the resulting potential uplift if their claim is successful of up to 25%, and also the EHRC potentially investigating. They're mutually, they are separate. So you could have a tribunal claim, or you could have the EHRC seeking to investigate. So on top of the reputational issues and costs associated with all of that.
So really something that organisations will need and want to get right. Tim, you've got lots of years of experience conducting workplace and other investigations. I'm really interested in your views here.
Yeah, I think there's two really key points. I mean, this remains an investigation, and it will have similar principles to be applied to it and ways of investigating as it would apply to many other investigations. But there are two really key parts for me. And the first part is Eve referred to training managers as to how to respond when somebody brings a matter like this forward. You can't plan for when it's going to happen. You can't plan for where it's going to happen. You can't plan for how it's going to happen. But it will happen at some point in a career. If you're managing quite a lot of people, something like this will land on your desk. So that planning and preparation, that training is absolutely key. So that the first thing is about how do you get the best, how do you provide the best support to the person who's bringing these things forward, because you know they can range from anything, as we've said, from somebody who may have overheard inappropriate behaviour or conduct to all the way through to a serious sexual crime. So how you respond to that person who may well be traumatised by that, but not overtly traumatised, is key, both in providing support to that person, but also in responding to what it is that they have to say to you. And there's an awful lot of research being put into this. Professor Gary Shaw, who's a former Northumbria police officer, who's professor at Sunderland University, did a national piece of work called Achieving Best Evidence. It's 500 pages long. It's on gov.uk site, and it provides a wealth of information in this area. But it talks basically in that initial conversation about 4 phases. The first phase is establishing that rapport. So if you've done some preparation and planning and you've done some training, you will have a better understanding of how to respond to somebody, to recognise signs and symptoms of somebody being traumatised, in distress. The second part is allowing people to speak. And I know it sounds very simple, but that's called free narrative. What you don't want to be doing at this stage is interrupting somebody and asking them questions, and you'll have 1,000 questions that you want to ask, but you really need to let people just go. That third phase is when you start breaking that narrative down and exhausting each area before you finally close off the conversation. That's exactly the process safe calls, call handlers use, rapport build, free narrative, then some questions, and then close that conversation, summarize it, see what you've got. So that's really important to do that, and to do it in that sequence. The second really key part of this is appointing an investigator. Many people get these things to do as edge of desk type scenarios. Your investigator needs to be trained. I would suggest in a matter like this is not something that you would throw a new investigator into. You would ideally want somebody who has some experience. Because of the nature of these types of things, is that investigator a good cultural fit? There are many regions of the world that we've supported investigations in, where just the mere mentioning of a sexual allegation against a female could be catastrophic in their community. So investigators need to be aware of the cultural fits. And obviously within the UK, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of different cultures all living together in the UK. And we need to be mindful of the fact that one size doesn't fit all. Gender is pretty crucial in this area. Would a male investigator be the right person to be investigating, especially in taking that first account from a female victim? And the best person to ask that question of is the victim. Who's the victim most comfortable with? It might not always be as obvious as male for male and female for female. And that's kind of writ large for me. All of these things you should be considering for every investigation, But because these can be really quite difficult, they are the two main parts of it. That initial conversation, and then who are you appointing to look into it. And this type of investigation is so nuanced. There's so many different traits, which Christine, I'm sure, can comment on, where it's investigating a bullying allegation, for example, is a relatively straightforward matter. But you have all these different types of harassment that could feature in a sexual harassment case. So if your investigator is not experienced, please make sure that whatever business partner, HR business partner, you would presumably put in to support that person as a real good handle on this. Because first and foremost, you want to do right by the person who's been subject to this behaviour, but you also want to make sure that you get it right, so that if it does have to end up in an employment tribunal, that you don't lose that through not collecting your evidence, through not carrying out your investigation in the right way on the way through.
Thank you, Tim. Conscious of time, we've only got 5 minutes remaining. What we'll do is we'll continue, and then if people are able to stay on for the questions at the end, we'll answer the questions, and as I say, we can follow up separately. I think it's fair to say, though, that one of the main areas that we get asked to support with investigations is around the ability to be independent, and ultimately a lot of organisations feel that having that independent pair of eyes on these sorts of matters can be helpful. That's something that Tim and the team work closely with lots of our clients to support with. I think we saw earlier that sexual harassment can take different forms. It can be, all of which can have a significant impact on the person who experiences it, but it can be inappropriate banter, or as Tim sort of talked about there, it could be a very serious sexual crime. Does that have an impact? And Tim, I'll ask you if you could give me a brief answer, then I'd love to go to Christine, but does that have an impact on the sort of investigation that's carried out?
Yeah, you would need to be really careful, and it would require close liaison with the police, because what you don't want to get into a situation is where, if it's a crime and starts being investigated as a crime, and someone may be liable to end up in a court over it, you don't want to confuse and potentially corrupt that investigation by taking your internal investigation too far. It's all about that liaison with the police once a police investigation has started. Somebody who has an allegation made against them may well be getting advice not to say anything. That doesn't mean that at a future time, when a police investigation, a criminal investigation is completed, that may not be the case. So good legal advice and good liaison with the police. And finally on that, for me, if someone is reporting a serious sexual matter, then most forensic opportunities would be lost after about 7 days. So if someone is going to report it, then it can be, that's one of the issues that can be raised, that, and like I say, any support and forensic evidence is likely to be gone after 7 days.
Thank you, Tim. Christine, anything you'd like to add?
No, I agree entirely with what Tim was saying. You understanding at the outset what the potential outcome, the scenarios could be, depending on the nature of the allegation, the severity of the allegation. So Tim's covered the police point, which is really important if you're looking at a criminal matter that will impact potentially your investigation. The other potential scenarios is if, particularly if it's serious, you may be ending up, depending on the outcome of the investigation. And obviously the key point is you need an unbiased investigation, hence the points about being independent. And you may end up with findings showing that the allegations are not upheld, or that they are in fact upheld. And then you may end up in a sort of employment process or disciplinary process, and potentially litigation. And having that in your mind and making sure you have a robust investigation that will stand up to scrutiny if you end up in those processes is really important. And also, if you, in certain sectors, there are regulatory considerations as well. And so the output of the investigation may have consequences beyond just employment, and therefore having a robust investigation that you can rely on may be important from that regulatory perspective as well. So understanding all of that at the outset and understanding how you then will impact on how you then deal with that investigation and who the right person is to do the investigation.
Thank you, Christine. So I'm just going to briefly summarise the key points from today's session, and then we will stay on and answer some of these questions for a few minutes if people are able to stay. If not, it's recorded so you can catch up on it later. But the key takeaways are, important to do a risk assessment and assess the risks of sexual harassment in your workplace and take steps to mitigate those risks. Have a clear and accessible procedure for reporting sexual harassment and make sure that everybody understands it. Training for managers and HR professionals on how to investigate and handle complaints is essential. And like we said earlier, if you would like more information around Eve's courses, please do let us know. And I can see that's on the screen there. So thanks for putting that on, Emma. Support for employees, I mean, super important. It kind of goes without saying, but, really, employers must provide support and sensitivity to those employees who've experienced sexual harassment and have the courage to speak up about it. Regularly review and update your policies and make sure that they're effective. And I suppose, with regards to what Christine was saying earlier, the law is changing as well, and it looks as though it might change again. So just making sure that you are up to date on those things. And we're likely to do more of these webinars, so please do keep an eye out for those as well, and we'll keep you as up to date as we can. And then if something is raised, obviously that thorough investigation is really important. A few of you have already said that you would be interested in finding out more about the courses, so we will be in touch about that. And we're also going to be sending out a discount code for the sexual harassment training course for those who've joined us today, so keep an eye out for that. Right, without further ado, I'm just going to rush to a couple of questions. There's quite a few around the same kind of topic around anonymity. So Gemma asked, when an individual wishes to remain anonymous, is there advice or guidance given by SafeCall to the caller about what this may mean? For example, how that can limit the organisation's ability to investigate. She also says that they find that whistleblowers don't often log back in to look at the responses. This is a common question and comment that we get from clients, Gemma. And the short answer is yes. If they do call us and they speak to one of our call handlers, then, depending on the nature of the report that they're raising, they will explain the next steps and also explain if there's going to be limited, if the information is limited or it's going to be difficult to follow up the investigation. And as Tim said earlier, what may happen in that scenario is they may choose to share their contact details with us, which means that they can receive notifications about updates from the system, or alternatively, they may decide that they do wish to be named. It's more difficult if they make an online report, because obviously we only have the information that they then share with us. So then that two-way reporting channel is the only way really of you being able to communicate with them. I think the other thing you can do there, though, is when you're promoting your whistleblowing channels internally, kind of try and educate them so they understand that and they understand kind of the opportunity and the limitations of it, so that perhaps that will factor into their thinking when they're going to raise a report. Cara said, thank you, Cara, for saying it's a great session. I work in the retail sector, and the legislation now extends the duty to prevent against environmental factors, which includes customers, which we did touch on that at the beginning. We have our policy around how to escalate report in the moment and training provided too, which gives guidance to colleagues on how to deal with it. Is there any other guidance that can be shared or best practice for businesses with colleagues in customer-facing roles? I think that's a great question, and probably one for Christine, if you've got any ideas about that.
Sure. I think there's a lot of discussion in the EHRC guidance about the use of signage and making sure it's clear to customers and other third parties, you won't tolerate sexual harassment and that, there are consequences for it. So I think as part of the prevention piece, ensuring that you do have some of that signage around to really just discourage people from acting inappropriately. And then the challenge with third parties is getting evidence from the third party so that you can do something about the behaviour. So the sooner that you're able to interact with the third party and get whatever information you can to help with that investigation, the better.
Thank you. And the last question that we'll take, there will be follow-ups for all of those people asking for those online, so thank you for that. The last question then, and then we must wrap up, is if someone reports sexual harassment, and we sort of covered this before, but I think, again, Christine, this is probably a good question for you. If someone reports sexual harassment but then reports to the police as well, which investigation takes priority and how do we support or manage that?
So I'm sure Tim will have a view on this as well. Normally we'd want to find out what the police what their plans are, because if they are going to say, you know what, we want to investigate the individuals and speak to the relevant witnesses first, we would normally give precedence to that. Obviously there's a timing issue, and from an employment perspective you can't have an unreasonable delay in investigating a matter, so there is you need to bear that in mind too. But clearly if the police say, well, we would rather that we spoke to the witnesses first, you should have regard to that. But that's why it's important to understand at the start what the next steps are likely to be.
Thank you, Christine. Anything final that you would like to add there, Tim, before we wrap up?
Yeah, it's just, don't forget that the police and the Crown Prosecution Service would be looking for an evidential balance that was beyond reasonable doubt. Whereas when you're investigating in the workplace, you're investigating on a balance of probabilities. So you're only looking for, I would suggest the more serious the matter, you'd be looking for more than 51%, but in theory and in practicality, that balance is much lower. Why and that's one of the reasons it's really important to keep that distinction between the two as best you can. Not forgetting that for a serious sexual crime, it could be years before it gets to a court. So what are you going to do? And I'll just pose that question for you as we leave. What are you going to do with that person in your workplace or not, as the case may be, for quite an extended period of time?
Thanks, Tim. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. As we said, we will be in touch with more information, with the recording from today and with answers to any of your specific questions. So with that, thanks very much to the speakers. I found that really interesting and informative, and I know that lots of people have said they did as well, so really appreciate that, and hope everyone enjoys the rest of this lovely sunny day. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.